During the Second World War, under Adolf Hitler's regime, Nazi doctors and scientists conducted some of the most horrific experiments ever recorded in human history. These so-called medical studies were performed on prisoners held in concentration camps. Jews, Poles, Roma, and Soviet captives were stripped of all rights and treated as disposable test subjects. At Auschwitz, Nazi physician Dr. Josef Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death, performed brutal experiments on twins and children in pursuit of racial science. He selected twins from arriving prisoners, measuring and injecting them with unknown chemicals, comparing their bodies in cruel detail. When one died, the other was killed so that their organs could be dissected together. In Nazi concentration camps, doctors conducted so-called medical experiments that were in truth acts of cruelty. Prisoners were frozen in icy tanks to test survival in cold water and aviation crashes. Others were deliberately infected with malaria, typhus, and tuberculosis to test unproven drugs. In the name of science, human cruelty reached its lowest depths. At Nazi camps like Dachau, prisoners were deliberately starved to study how little food a body could endure. Many died slowly so data could be recorded on rescue diets. After World War II, the world learned the full horror of Nazi medicine. Experiments on prisoners under the guise of science. In 1946, 23 doctors and officials were tried in Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. Freezing tests, infections, mutilations were all done without consent. In the Philippines, at present, the evolution of research ethics began with the creation of the Philippine Health Research Ethics Board, or FREB, under the Department of Science and Technology. In recent years, FREB formed an ad hoc committee to update the National Ethical Guidelines for Health and Health-related Research, ensuring alignment with global standards like the Helsinki Declaration and the Nuremberg Code. Meanwhile, the Food and Drug Administration, operating under the Department of Health, issues and enforces regulations for clinical trials, including Administrative Order 2020-10, which requires ethics review, trial registration, and insurance for participants. The Philippine General Hospital of UP Manila serves as one of the nation's leading host institutions, conducting FDA-approved clinical trials in collaboration with local and international partners where ethical oversight, science, and patient protection meet in practice. Today, we'll talk about what happens when medicine, science, and law intersect and sometimes collide in real life. We've seen this vividly in our own country, from the Dengvaxia controversy, where questions of vaccine safety, informed consent, and government accountability dominated headlines, to the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, where emergency use authorizations and reports of possible adverse events tested our regulatory and ethical systems. These situations remind us that clinical research isn't just about discovering new cures. It's also about protecting people when things go wrong. In this session, we'll unpack what clinical research really is, who the key players are, and what happens when a participant is injured or dies. We'll look at both sides, how the law prosecutes negligence and how the defense establishes compliance and good faith. And because this is our home ground, we'll focus on the Philippine context, exploring our laws, ethical codes, and court rulings that define accountability in research and vaccine safety. What is clinical research? Clinical research is defined by AO 2020-10 as any systematic investigation in human participants to evaluate investigational products or interventions. Its goal is to generate evidence on safety, efficacy, and tolerability of medical therapies. Unlike routine care, clinical research follows strict protocols, regulatory oversight, and ethical review. In the Philippine setting, all trials must be registered with the FDA and approved by an accredited research ethics committee before any participant is enrolled. Why do we do this clinical trial? Every medicine or vaccine we use today, from pain relievers to life-saving immunizations, had to pass through these four phases of clinical research before being approved for public use. The purpose of these stages is the same: to evaluate safety and efficacy, in short, to make sure a new drug or medical device works and won't do harm. Phase 1 is where it all begins. This phase usually involves a small number of healthy volunteers. The goal here isn't to prove that the drug works, but to find out if it's safe at all, what doses can be tolerated, and what side effects might occur. Think of it as a safety test before the medicine even reaches patients. But before the phase 1, there are animal studies. Phase 2 expands to a few hundred participants who actually have the disease being studied. Here, the focus is on whether the treatment seems to help and whether the side effects are manageable. It's the first glimpse of real-world benefit. Now, phase 1 and phase 2 trials are not usually done in the Philippines. They are done elsewhere. Phase 3 is where the things get serious. Thousands of participants, multiple hospitals, and direct comparison with standard treatments. This is the phase that can make or break a product's future. The evidence from this stage is what regulatory bodies like the Philippine FDA or the World Health Organization rely on for approval. And finally, phase 4 happens after a product is approved and rolled out to the public. We call this post-marketing surveillance. It's where rare or delayed side effects often appear. Precisely what happened with the Dengvaxia controversy, when adverse effects emerged after mass immunization. Similarly, During the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, the FDA's Emergency Use Authorization, or the EUAs, required continued phase 4 monitoring and reporting of suspected vaccine-related injuries or deaths. Each phase adds a new layer of evidence, but also a new level of ethical and legal responsibility. The higher the phase, the greater the duty to ensure transparency, informed consent, and prompt reporting of adverse events because at every step, real people's lives are involved. Four key instruments govern clinical research in the Philippines. First, RA 9711, which empowers the FDA to supervise all clinical investigations. Second, Administrative Order 2020-10 sets the operational standards, ethical review, safety monitoring, and insurance. Third, the National Ethical Guidelines for Health Research, which is already updated in the 2022 National Ethical Guidelines for Research involving human participants from FREB, outlines principles of respect, beneficence, and justice. Finally, RA 10173 protects participant data privacy. Together, this ensures that human research proceeds only when it upholds both scientific integrity and human dignity. Types of liability. Liability can be civil, criminal, administrative, or even professional. Civil liability involves damages for negligence. Criminal cases arise when harm results from reckless or intentional acts. Administrative sanctions come from agencies like the FDA or FREB, and professional sanctions may come from the PRC or the institution itself. Often, these overlap. One incident can lead to all four types of proceedings. The research chain of responsibility. Imagine research as a chain. Each link the team, the investigator, the sponsor, the ethics board, and the institution. Each carries its own duty of care. If one link breaks, harm can reach the participant. Legally, everyone in this chain can be held liable depending on what went wrong and who had control at the time. The principal investigator. The principal investigator serves as the head of the research team and is ultimately responsible for ensuring that the clinical study is conducted properly and ethically. They are selected by the sponsor based on expertise and experience. One of their first duties is to present the study protocol to the Review Ethics Committee, or what we call the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, for approval. Once the protocol is cleared, the principal investigator ensures that the trial is conducted strictly according to that approved plan. Throughout the study, the principal investigator must record accurate and verifiable data, maintain participant confidentiality, and ensure compliance with data protection laws. Crucially, they are also responsible for reporting any adverse events to the FDA, the IRB, and the study sponsor promptly. Their leadership and diligence are essential in protecting participants, preserving scientific integrity, and meeting both regulatory and ethical obligations. Duties of the principal investigator. The principal investigator is responsible for four essential domains. Under the duty of care, the principal investigator must protect participants from foreseeable harm, monitor for adverse events, and ensure that informed consent is properly obtained and understood. Regulatory compliance requires following the IRB or REC approved protocols and meeting national and international standards such as those of the FDA, the EMA, the Philippine FDA, and good clinical practice. They must also maintain complete and accurate documentation. In overseeing the study, the principal investigator supervises the research team, ensures protocol adherence, and promptly reports deviations from the protocol or safety concerns. Lastly, the principal investigator safeguards data integrity and confidentiality, ensuring data is accurate, participant identities are protected, and any risk of falsification or conflict of interest is avoided. Principal investigators may face criminal liability if their actions involved intentional harm, fraud, or gross misconduct. This includes falsifying research data, potentially violates the Revised Penal Code Article 171 for falsification of public documents by public officers or private individuals involved in official records. Article 172 is on the falsification by private individuals and use of falsified documents. Conducting clinical trials without ethics or FDA approval violates RA 3720 as amended by RA 9711, which is the FDA Act of 2009. Section 11B is on the prohibition of clinical trials without prior FDA authorization. Section 14 penalizes violations with 1 to 10 years of imprisonment and or 50,000 to 500,000 fine. Causing harm to participants through reckless or unethical experimentation may fall under the Revised Penal Code Article 365 on reckless imprudence resulting in physical injuries or homicide, or the Revised Penal Code Articles 262 to 266, which is the serious or less serious physical injuries, especially if arising from negligent or reckless conduct. Using unapproved medical interventions may also violate RA 7394 of the Consumer Act, particularly Articles 97 to 100, if the subject is misled or harmed by unapproved treatments under deceptive pretense. It may also violate RA 10173 or the Data Privacy Act if sensitive health information is processed without valid consent. Civil liability is more common and arises when a participant suffers harm due to a principal investigator's negligence. For example, by failing to act on adverse events or to ensure proper monitoring. Under Article 2176 of the Civil Code, this can be considered a quasi-delict, where obligations arising from contracts or consent are violated. Articles 1157 to 1160 may apply. Affected parties may claim various forms of damages, including actual or moral damages under Articles 2201 to 2208. For research team members, doctors, nurses, or assistants share responsibility. If a staff member performs a procedure beyond authority or falsifies data, they may be liable along with the principal investigator. Under Article 2180 of the Civil Code, the principal investigator and the institution can also be held vicariously liable for their acts if supervision was lacking. For the sponsor is typically the entity that owns the investigational drug or medical device and funds the clinical study. They are not just financiers. They carry a strict legal and ethical obligation to monitor participant safety throughout the trial. This includes reviewing adverse event reports, ensuring protocol compliance, and halting the study if necessary. Importantly, the sponsor must also provide insurance coverage to protect participants in case of injury related to the study. Their role extends well beyond funding. It involves continuous oversight and accountability. Sponsors who initiate or finance unapproved clinical trials may face criminal prosecution under the FDA Act, which imposes penalties of up to 10 years imprisonment and significant fines. If they falsify regulatory filings or negligently allow participant harm, they may also be charged under the revised penal code for falsification or reckless imprudence. So when a participant is harmed due to the sponsor's failure to uphold their duty, such as by neglecting safety monitoring or failing to provide compensation, civil liability arises. Under the Civil Code, this can result in payment of actual damages, and in serious cases, moral or exemplary damages for pain and suffering or gross misconduct. Regulatory bodies like the FDA and IRBs can impose administrative penalties on sponsors who fail to monitor safety, report adverse events, or insure participants. This may include trial suspension, monetary fines, and bans on future research activities. These are corrective actions aimed at enforcing ethical and procedural compliance. Oversight bodies, such as the Institutional Review Board or also called Ethics Review Committee, play a critical role in safeguarding the integrity of clinical research. Their duties include reviewing study protocols, not only for scientific validity but also for legal and ethical compliance. Once a study begins, they are responsible for monitoring the conduct of the principal investigators, particularly whether the approved protocol is being followed. They also review reports of adverse events to determine if corrective action is needed. Importantly, they have the authority to suspend or terminate a study if there are significant violations of the protocol, safety risks to participants, or breaches of laws and FDA regulations. Their function ensures that research upholds both scientific rigor and participant protection. Although rare, institutional review board members may face criminal liability if they knowingly approve unethical or unauthorized clinical trials, particularly if such conduct leads to harm. They could be charged under the revised penal code for falsification or reckless imprudence, or under the FDA Act for enabling illegal trials. If an IRB negligently approves or fails to monitor a study that results in participant harm, it may be sued under the Civil Code for quasi-delict, or failure to uphold its duty of care can also constitute a breach of obligation. In such cases, injured parties may seek compensation for actual losses and even moral damages depending on the extent of negligence. IRBs operate under the supervision of regulatory bodies like the Philippine Health Research Ethics Board or FREB and the FDA. Failure to uphold ethical review standards, monitor ongoing research, or enforce protocol compliance can lead to administrative sanctions such as delisting, suspension, or formal reprimand. The institution. The host hospital or university, like here in our university, our hospital is the Philippine General Hospital, which serves as the institutional platform where the clinical study is physically and operationally conducted. It plays a supervisory role over both the Research Ethics Committee or Institutional Review Board and the principal investigator, ensuring that all ethical and regulatory obligations are followed on site. Additionally, the institution is responsible for reviewing and formally executing agreements with the study sponsor, typically in the form of a clinical trial agreement and, when applicable, a material transfer agreement. These contracts are often facilitated through a contract research organization and ensure that responsibilities, liabilities, and protections for all parties, especially participants, are clearly defined. Behind every trial is a contract called the Clinical Trial Agreement. It sets out who does what, who pays for what, and who's liable if a participant is harmed. It includes confidentiality rules, insurance clauses, and dispute resolution steps. It may not sound exciting, but it's the backbone of accountability. When a case reaches court, this contract often decides who ends up paying the bills and sometimes who goes to jail. An institution may face criminal liability if it allows clinical trials to proceed without regulatory or ethics approval. This includes criminal negligence resulting in harm to participants or complicity in document falsification by hospital officials. Under the FDA Act and the revised penal code, penalties may include fines or imprisonment depending on the severity of the violation. Civil liability arises when an institution fails in its duty to supervise research conduct or contractual obligations under clinical trial agreements. If harm occurs due to poor oversight or lack of safety protocols, the institution may be held accountable and required to pay damages for injury, suffering, or death resulting from the breach. Institutions are subject to regulatory oversight by the FDA and FREB. If a host hospital or university fails to enforce ethical safeguards, proper, properly monitoring clinical trials, or maintain approved research governance, it may be sanctioned. Consequences include suspension from hosting future studies or revocation of its affiliated IRB's accreditation. The regulators, which consists of the FDA for trial authorization and surveillance, the DOH for policy and vaccine safety, the FREB for ethics accreditation, and the PRC for professional discipline. So, oversight doesn't end at the institutional level. So, the FDA issues clinical trial permits and monitors adverse events. The DOH ensures compliance with public health policy. FREB accredits ethics boards, while the PRC can sanction professionals for unethical conduct. Together, they form the government's safety net to prevent harm and uphold public trust in research. The research participants. Rights of research participants. Participants are not just data points, they are people. They have the right to know what they're getting into, to give or withhold consent freely, and to walk away anytime. Their privacy must be respected, their medical care guaranteed, and their injuries, if any, treated and compensated. These aren't just ethical ideals, they are legal duties. Ignoring them can mean lawsuits, fines, or even criminal charges. Duties of a research participant. When individuals enroll in a clinical research study, they take on limited responsibilities. This include being honest about their medical history, complying with study procedures, and promptly reporting side effects or unexpected reactions. These duties help ensure participant safety and data reliability. While not legal agents, participants agree to support the research process ethically and safely. Violations, do they bar damage claims? Violating study expectations doesn't automatically eliminate a participant's right to sue. The legal question becomes whether the participant's conduct was a major factor in the injury. Courts look at the degree of non-compliance. Was it significant or just a small deviation? Even if participants contributed to the outcome, they may still have valid claims if the harm was largely preventable or due to sponsor oversight. These are the legal doctrines that may apply. Three legal doctrines are often considered in these cases. Assumption of risk means a participant agreed to known dangers. Comparative negligence divides liability when both parties contributed to harm. However, even with informed consent, participants cannot waive the right to hold sponsors accountable for reckless conduct or gross negligence. Case example of contributory fault. The scenario: participant hides use of another medication and as a result suffers liver injury. If study drug was already risky, sponsor may share liability. If disclosure could have prevented harm, participant is or may be considered partially at fault. Real cases and lessons. The Dengvaxia controversy revealed weaknesses in post-marketing surveillance. Phase 4 monitoring failed to detect risk early. The COVID-19 vaccine rollout, by contrast, emphasized transparency through FDA emergency use authorizations and vaccine injury compensation programs. These experiences show that science and law must evolve together. Safety cannot end at approval. Principles of accountability. Legal responsibility follows five key principles. Institutions can be liable for staff actions. Sponsors face strict accountability for insurance and safety monitoring. Investigators are personally liable for negligence. Ethics boards must act when risks arise. And institutions must ensure compliance systems work. When all these levels function, harm and litigation are far less likely. On the defense side, one of the strongest shields is evidence of valid informed consent. Documentation that the participant understood and voluntarily accepted foreseeable risk can mitigate liability. Additionally, proving strict compliance with ethical and regulatory requirements like the Review Ethics Committee approval, the FDA authorization, monitoring logs, and timely reporting demonstrates good faith and diligence. Courts often look at whether the investigator acted as a reasonably competent professional following accepted good clinical practice standards. Another critical defense is contesting causation. Not every adverse event is proof of negligence. Injuries or deaths may stem from the participant's underlying disease or a known pharmacologic risk disclosed in consent forms. Defense experts can demonstrate that the event was unforeseeable or unrelated to the investigational product. Scientific uncertainty often becomes the decisive factor. If reasonable doubt exists about causation, criminal liability cannot be sustained. In administrative investigations, transparency helps. Showing you promptly reported adverse events and took corrective steps can avoid harsh penalties. In civil suits for damages under Article 2176, you can argue that there was no fault or that other factors contributed to the harm. Sponsors often rely on indemnity and insurance clauses in the clinical trial agreement to cover expenses, but those work only if they met their ethical duties in good faith. Risk management and preventive measures. Prevention is still the best defense. Always get ethics approval before recruiting participants. Train your team in good clinical practice. Keep proper records. Report every adverse event, even minor ones. And never cut corners on safety or documentation. Institutions should maintain insurance and independent monitoring boards. When oversight and transparency are in place, most legal problems can be avoided before they even start. Documentary evidence. These documents form the legal and ethical foundation of any clinical trial. The protocol, the informed consent forms, and ethics approval prove whether the trial was authorized and ethically sound. The FDA permit an investigator's brochure to establish legal compliance and the known risk profile at the time the trial began. In the event of litigation, these documents are critical for proving whether investigators and sponsors acted promptly and responsibly when adverse events occurred. Patterns of non-reporting, protocol violations, or ignored red flags may support claims of negligence or failure to act. The legal insurance institutional records. These records establish contractual obligations, risk-sharing provisions, and the host institution's responsibilities. Insurance documents determine compensation accessed, while medical records and autopsy reports help determine whether injury or death was trial related. They often serve as the cornerstone of civil claims or defenses. In the end, clinical research should never be a trade off between science and human life. Our laws, the Republic Act 9711, Administrative Order 2020-10, the ethical guidelines, remind us that progress without protection is exploitation. When accidents happen, the law demands accountability, but it also recognizes honest effort and due care. Whether you're a lawyer, a doctor, a researcher, remember, ethics is not just paperwork. It's the soul of good science and good law. And finally, science seeks cures, but law guards the cure's soul, reminding us that every clinical trial is not just an experiment on life, but a promise to protect it.